January 17, 1945, Zossen, Germany. Deep beneath the pine forests of Brandenburg, 30 miles south of a crumbling Berlin, the concrete lungs of the Maybach I bunker complex hum with a frantic, dying energy. The air is thick with the smell of scorched paper and the ozone of overworked teleprinters. Here, in the subterranean nerve center of the German Army High Command, a lone intelligence officer named Colonel Reinhard Gehlen watches as his staff feeds decades of secret history into portable incinerators. But Gehlen is not burning everything. In the dim light of a flickering bulb, he shoves a series of heavy, water-resistant canisters into a ventilation shaft documents, detailing a shadow war fought in the radio waves and the deep forests of the East. Far from the prying eyes of the Red Army or the Western Allies, these are the Foreign Armies East vials, containing decryptions of Soviet codes and Japanese diplomatic secrets that prove the official history of the Great Patriotic War is a carefully constructed lie. Outside, the distant thunder of Soviet Katyusha rockets shakes the earth, a rhythmic pounding that threatens to bury these secrets forever under tons of reinforced concrete and German soil. If these canisters are ever unearthed, they will reveal a conflict defined not by the movements of grand armies, but by the silent betrayals of the men who led them. The world of 1939 was a theater of masks. While the public watched the grand movements of divisions across the borders of Poland and France, a secondary, invisible infrastructure was being laid, one built on the fragile foundation of the radio wave. To understand the documents found in the Zossen bunkers, one must first understand the black chambers of the great powers. In the late 1930s, signals intelligence, or SIGINT, was an infant science practiced by men in windowless rooms who lived in a state of perpetual, quiet panic. The British had Bletchley Park, the Americans had the Signal Intelligence Service, and the Germans had the Forschungsamt, a shadowy wiretapping agency that operated under the personal whims of Hermann Göring. The geopolitical landscape was a shifting mosaic of unbreakable codes and eternal non-aggression pacts. In August 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact shocked the globe, seemingly uniting the two most ideologically opposed regimes on Earth. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union? On the surface, it was a marriage of convenience to carve up Eastern Europe. But beneath the diplomatic handshakes, a lethal game of electronic voyeurism was already in motion. The Germans were listening to Soviet diplomatic traffic, and the Soviets utilizing a vast network of Rote Kapelle, or Red Orchestra spies were embedded in the very heart of the German Air Ministry. Every shipment of grain from the USSR to the Reich, every barrel of oil, and every crate of machine parts was tracked not just by accountants, but by intelligence officers who knew that the alliance was a countdown to an inevitable explosion. The documents that would later reveal the hidden battles of this era began as these intercepted manifests. They were the first breadcrumbs of a trail leading to a conflict that the official histories of 1940 and 1941 would omit. The border skirmishes of necessity. These were small-scale, violent encounters between German and Soviet reconnaissance units along the new curtain of silence in partitioned Poland. They were battles fought for the sake of capturing a single codebook or a new radio transmitter, events that remained off the official war diaries, because to admit they happened was to admit the alliance was a sham. By the winter of 1940, the atmosphere in Europe was one of deceptive stillness. The phony war in the West, masking a feverish build-up in the East, the documents being generated in this period, the ones Gehlen would later try to hide, revealed that the German High Command was already mapping the Soviet Union's industrial heartland while their diplomats were still toasted in Moscow. It was a war of ink and shadows, where the most valuable terrain was not a hill or a bridge, but the internal frequency of an enemy's command network. The stage was being set for a revelation that would, decades later, prove that the true start of the war's most brutal phase was preceded by a year of secret, undeclared combat that cost thousands of lives before a single formal declaration of war was ever issued. As the calendar turned to 1941, the curtain of silence between Berlin and Moscow began to fray at the edges, revealing a logistical buildup of such staggering proportions that it could no longer be hidden by diplomatic pleasantries. The documents recovered from the Zossen complex and later Allied captures detail a period known as the intelligence blackout, where the German Abwehr and the Soviet GRU engaged in a lethal dance of disinformation. While history books often paint the June 22nd invasion as a total surprise to Stalin, the recovered internal manifests of the Soviet Fourth Army tell a more nuanced story of desperate, localized high-alert statuses that were systematically ignored by the Kremlin Central Command. The military environment of early 1941 was a pressure cooker. On one side, the Wehrmacht was repositioning its veterans from the fall of France into the dark forests of occupied Poland. On the other, the Red Army was undergoing a chaotic reorganization following the disastrous Winter War with Finland. The hidden documents of this era, specifically the Barbarossa dossiers, show that German intelligence had successfully mapped nearly 80% of Soviet forward airfields by March. However, these same documents revealed a terrifying truth that the German General Staff chose to suppress. The Soviet Union's industrial capacity beyond the Ural Mountains was growing at a rate the German economy could never match. Key locations like the city of Chelyabinsk, later known as Tankograd, were already being converted into massive production hubs. The documents revealed a secret war of industrial espionage, where German agents were being caught and executed in the frozen wastes of Siberia. Months before the 1st Panzer crossed the Bug River, these were not just soldiers dying. They were the first casualties of a technological race. The forces involved were not just the millions of men in uniform, but the tens of thousands of forced laborers and engineers working in secret, closed cities whose existence would not be officially acknowledged for another half-century. By May 1941, the secret protocols of the 1939 Pact were being shredded in the backrooms of the Reich Chancellery. The recovered communication logs from the German embassy in Moscow show a desperate attempt to maintain the facade of friendship while the OKW, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, was finalizing the deployment directive Barbarossa. This second phase of the context sets the stage for the true horror, a war that was lost on paper before it ever began in the mud. The German documents revealed that their intelligence officers knew the risks of a prolonged war were unsustainable, yet the momentum of the Nazi machine was already irreversible. The world was standing on the precipice of a clash that would consume 27 million Soviet lives, fueled by a set of documents that proved both sides knew exactly what was coming, yet both were powerless or too proud to stop it. The discovery of the Zossen files and the subsequent declassification of the Venona intercepts allows us to view the Second World War through a prism of specialized, hidden perspectives. The first of these is the technological angle. While history remembers the Enigma, the documents revealed a far more sophisticated machine. The Siemens and Hausk D-52, known as the Geheimschreiber, or secret writer. Unlike the portable Enigma, this was a massive, teleprinting beast used only by the highest echelons of the German High Command. The documents show that while the British struggled with Enigma, the Swedish mathematician Arne Berling cracked the T-52 using nothing but paper and pencil in just 2 weeks. This meant that for years, a neutral power Sweden was reading the most private thoughts of Adolf Hitler, a technological battle that remained a state secret until the 1970s. This digital warfare predated the modern era by decades, proving that the war was being won in the vacuum tubes of early computers as much as in the mud of Russia. Transitioning from the machines to the maneuvers, the tactical angle reveals the existence of ghost divisions. The decrypted Soviet logs found in the archives describe a series of diversionary battles in the summer of 1942 that never appeared in German situation reports. These were Maskirovka operations, tactical deceptions on a grand scale. The documents show that the Red Army successfully invented entire tank corps using inflatable decoys and fake radio traffic to draw German reserves away from the real offensive at Stalingrad. The German tactical maps from that period show commanders chasing shadows across the steppe, engaging in desperate firefights with rearguard units that were sacrifice pawns in a much larger, invisible game of chess. These weren't just mistakes. They were the result of a tactical brilliance that the German master race narrative refused to acknowledge, even as their lines were being systematically dismantled. Each angle reinforces the same truth. The war we know is a simplified version of a much more complex, documented reality. The T-52 intercepts and the tactical deceptions of 1942 illustrate a conflict where the most lethal weapon was in a Tiger tank or a Katyusha rocket, but the ability to control what the enemy perceived as reality. This control over perception would eventually lead to the most harrowing human cost of the intelligence war, the men and women who were intentionally sacrificed to protect the secret that the codes had been broken. Beyond the machines and the maps lie the more harrowing dimensions of this documented history, the human angle and the moral angle. The Zosin files and the Venona transcripts are not merely collections of numbers and coordinates. They are the death warrants of thousands of codebreakers and intelligence officers who lived and died in a vacuum of recognition. In the human angle, we see the shadow soldiers, men like the Soviet cryptanalyst Sergei Tolstov, whose name appears in no official victory parade. The documents reveal that during the height of the 1943 summer offensives, these analysts worked 20-hour shifts in subterranean bunkers, their health deteriorating as they stared at endless strings of Cyrillic and Latin characters. When the Germans began executing suspected signal corpsmen to plug leaks, these individuals continued their work, knowing that their own capture would mean a slow death in a Gestapo cellar. They were the first to know of impending massacres and the last to be allowed to speak of them, trapped by a duty that forbade them from even telling their families they were at war. This leads directly into the moral angle, perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Silent Front. The declassified records from the British and American archives, when cross-referenced with German situation reports, reveal a brutal calculus of acceptable loss. There are documented instances where Allied command knew, via ultra or magic intercepts, that a specific convoy or a specific infantry battalion was walking into an ambush. Yet to reroute the troops or warn the ships would alert the Axis that their codes were compromised. The documents show cold, handwritten marginalia by higher-ranking officials weighing the lives of 500 sailors against the strategic advantage of keeping a cipher secure for another month. It was a moral wasteland, where the greater good was measured in the blood of men who thought they were dying for a tactical error, when, in reality, they were being sacrificed to protect a mathematical secret. The moral weight of these decisions is reflected in the tone of the internal memos of 1944. There is a perceptible shift from clinical reporting to a sort of detached exhaustion. The leaders knew that the war was being won, but the cost recorded in these secret ledgers was a burden that could never be shared with the celebrating public. These documents reveal a conflict that was as much a battle of the soul as it was a battle of the bayonet. As the war reached its fever pitch in 1944, these angles converged into a single, terrifying reality. The official victory was being bought with a currency of secrets that would remain unspent for decades. The true climax of the Silent Front arrived in the sweltering summer of 1943, during the lead-up to the colossal clash at Kursk. While history books focus on the thousands of tanks prowling the steppe, the documents recovered from the Zosin complex and the declassified Lucy spy ring files reveal a much more surgical turning point. For months, the German OKW had been planning Unternehmen Citadel, Operation Citadel, a pincer movement designed to snip off the Soviet-held salient at Kursk. It was intended to be the masterstroke that regained the initiative for the Wehrmacht. However, the papers show that the Red Army knew the exact date, time, and composition of the German attack weeks before the 1st Panzer ignited its engine. The turning point was not a single explosion, but a single decryption. In late June 1943, a high-level German transmission, encoded via the Lawrence cipher, the more complex cousin of the Enigma, was intercepted by the British at Bletchley Park and anonymously funneled to Moscow through the Lucy Ring. The document, a detailed deployment map of the 9th Army and the 4th Panzer Army, revealed that Hitler had delayed the offensive several times to wait for new Tiger and Panther tanks. This delay, documented in frantic German logistical memos, was the fatal error. It gave the Soviets time to transform the Kursk salient into the most heavily fortified patch of ground on Earth, with over 3,000 miles of trenches and 1 million landmines. When the German offensive finally launched on July 5, 1943, they didn't encounter a surprised enemy. They drove into a pre-calculated death trap. The secret Soviet counter-preparation logs show that the Red Army opened their artillery barrage 30 minutes before the German attack was scheduled to begin, catching the German infantry in their assembly areas. This was the moment the myth of German strategic superiority shattered. The documents reveal a level of chaos in the German command that was never admitted to the public. Generals screaming into radios that the Soviets seemed to be reading their minds. In reality, they were reading their mail. The paper trail of July 1943 proves that the greatest tank battle in history was won by the codebreakers before a single shell was fired, shifting the momentum of the war irrevocably to the east. The second, and perhaps more desperate, turning point of this secret war occurred in the Pacific, recorded in the Z-Plan documents. In March 1944, a Japanese Kawanishi H-8K flying boat carrying Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, crashed into the sea off the coast of Cebu in the Philippines. In his possession was a red leather portfolio containing the Z-Plan, the entire Japanese strategy for a decisive battle against the U.S. Pacific Fleet. While the official history focuses on the sheer industrial might of the United States, the recovered logs of the Allied Intelligence Bureau, AIB, reveal that Filipino guerrillas recovered this satchel from the surf and smuggled it through jungle trails to a secret rendezvous point. The climax was a race against time. The Japanese launched a brutal, scorched earth search for the documents, executing villagers and burning coastal towns to recover the lost secrets. But by the time the Japanese High Command realized the depth of the breach, the Z-Plan had already been microfilmed and flown to Brisbane, Australia. The documents laid bare the Japanese intent to lure the U.S. Navy into a trap near the Marianas. This intelligence allowed Admiral Raymond Spruance to position his carriers with surgical precision. When the Japanese launched their massive carrier-based strike on June 19, 1944, they flew not into an unsuspecting fleet, but into a wall of American Hellcats and anti-aircraft fire. This event, famously known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, was the mechanical climax of the Pacific War. The documents show that the Japanese lost nearly 300 aircraft in a single day, a blow from which their naval air arm would never recover. Internally, the Japanese naval diaries from that week reflect a state of total paralysis. They couldn't understand how the Americans had anticipated their every move. The Z-Plan papers turned a gamble into a slaughter. By the time the sun set over the Philippine Sea, the path to the Japanese home islands was wide open, and the secret battle for those documents had saved tens of thousands of American lives while sealing the fate of the Japanese Empire. The smoke over the Philippine Sea and the scorched plains of Kursk eventually cleared, but the silence surrounding the documents that directed those battles would last for half a century. As the guns fell silent in May 1945, a new kind of war, a Cold War, began to freeze these records in place. The documents recovered by Colonel Gellin at Zossen did not lead to a public trial of strategic blunders. Instead, they became the foundation for the Gellin Organization, the precursor to the modern German BND. The Western Allies realized that the intelligence contained in these files was too valuable to share with the world, or even with their former Soviet partners. The immediate aftermath was characterized by a massive systematic cleansing of the historical record. In the late 1940s, both the United States and the Soviet Union launched operations to recruit the very cryptanalysts and intelligence officers who had spent the war hunting them. The Venona project, which began as a top-secret effort to decrypt Soviet diplomatic cables, remained so classified that even President Harry Truman was reportedly not fully briefed on its extent for years. The documents revealed a staggering truth. The Manhattan Project had been compromised by Soviet spies almost from its inception. Had these documents been made public in 1946, the political fallout would have likely ignited a Third World War before the ruins of the Second had even cooled. Because of this, the Silent Front remained silent. Veterans of Bletchley Park and the Arlington Hall code-breaking centers returned to civilian life under strict oaths of secrecy, unable to tell their spouses or children that they had shortened the war by years. The numbers tell a grim story of this suppression. While millions of soldiers were demobilized and celebrated, the tens of thousands of intelligence casualties, Those whose work led to the sacrifice of their own units to protect codes were erased from the official casualty lists. The aftermath wasn't just about reconstruction. It was about the curation of a clean history that omitted the messy, moral compromises of the Shadow War. As the decades passed, the physical evidence of these hidden battles began to emerge, often contradicting the sanitized versions of history taught in schools. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, archives in Moscow and the former East Germany were briefly thrown open, revealing the true scale of the destruction that the documents had hinted at. Forensic teams began to find mass graves in the forests of Belarus and Poland that matched the coordinates found in the Silent Front manifests. These were not just victims of the Holocaust, but thousands of soldiers from ghost units, men whose very existence had been wiped from the official rolls because they were part of failed intelligence operations or deceptions. The destruction was not just human, but psychological. The documents revealed that the psychological toll on the leaders who managed these secrets was immense. Reports from the 1950s, finally declassified in the 2010s, show that many of the high-level codebreakers suffered from chronic PTSD, haunted by the godlike power they held over the lives of men they would never meet. The shift in strategy was also profound. The realization that codes could be broken so systematically led to the development of the one-time pad and early digital encryption, forever changing the nature of statcraft. In the physical world, the rusted hulls of ships and tanks found in unlikely places hundreds of miles from reported front lines finally matched the paper trail of the secret skirmishes. Verifiable reports from the Venona declassifications in 1995 confirmed that many accidents of the war were actually planned assassinations or tactical strikes guided by intercepted data. The aftermath of the Zossen discovery proved that the war did not end in 1945. It simply transitioned into a global stalemate where the lessons of the Silent Front became the rules of the New World Order. The document trail provides a sobering look at a reality where victory wasn't just about who had the most guns, but who held the most secrets and who was willing to bury them the deepest. History is often written by the victors, but it is curated by the survivors. The discovery of the Zossen files, the Z-Plan, and the eventual declassification of the Venona intercepts serves as a chilling reminder that the map is not the territory. For over half a century, the world lived with a version of the Second World War that was heroic, linear, and relatively transparent. We saw the beaches of Normandy and the ruins of Stalingrad through a lens of inevitable triumph. But the documents tell a different story, one of a war fought in a cold, mathematical vacuum where human lives were weighed against the integrity of a radio frequency. This hidden history teaches us that the true nature of modern warfare is not found in the roar of the engines, but in the silence of the archives. The Silent Front was a conflict of total exposure, where leaders looked through the eyes of their enemies and soldiers died for secrets they did not know existed. It reveals a terrifying evolution in human conflict. The moment where information became more valuable than the people who carried it. As we look back on these yellowing pages and decrypted cables, we are forced to confront a grounded yet emotional truth. The men and women who worked in the shadows, the analysts, the codebreakers, and the ghost divisions were the architects of our modern world. They built a world of signals, surveillance, and invisible borders. Their legacy is the realization that the official history of any great event is often just the surface of a much deeper, darker ocean. In the end, these documents do more than just reveal a battle the world never knew. They remind us that, even in the most well-documented era of human history, the most important truths are often the ones we were never meant to find. The canisters buried in the ventilation shafts of Zossen and the leather satchels recovered from the Pacific surf were not just records of a war, they were the first blueprints of the information age. They stand as a testament to the fact that while the guns eventually fell silent, the war for the truth never truly ends.